Oh, welcome and thank you for watching. This is the London system versus Maxim 1000, part of the chess.com intermediate bots, and this is game one, so let's begin. D4 is the opening in the London. A5, bishop to F4, D6, E3, A4, and we will block with A3, D5, knight to F3, H6, B knight to D2, queen to D7, bishop to D3, queen to C6, and C3, and then finally G6. Now we'll pause just for a moment here to look at our lines of attack, along with the light square bishop, dark square bishop, of course the knight at F3 to come to the E5 square. These should all be familiar to you, as well as the template for the London system setup, which we have as our guide right below here. If all of this so far is not familiar to you, let me encourage you to go back to some of the early videos where I explain the opening of the London and we go into it in detail. We also have the opportunity to castle if we need to. The queen has her lines of attack along these light square diagonals. If the black king castles, then we will begin to push our pawns backed by our rook at H1. So all of this is part of the London strategic lines of attack. So right now, as I look at the board, there really is one standout move that I would like to make, and that is to bring this knight at F3 up to E5 and target the queen. So let's go ahead and do that. The queen responds by coming to D6. Now, if you look at the board for just a moment, you're going to see a familiar pattern, a familiar scenario that we have been through before, and it concerns the dark square bishop pinning our knight to the queen, and it is white's move. Now, we've seen this before. Let me quickly just kind of go through the octagon of influence, as I call it, with the knight, because we have an opportunity to move the knight, and then the bishop will have direct eyes on the queen. So we want to, in the octagon of influence, look at the squares that we do not want to move to first. So here, 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 here. Probably not here because there's no real advantage, nor is there an advantage here. However, moving to the G6 square would give us the opportunity to attack both simultaneously the rook and the bishop, or moving here to the F7 square, we would be able to attack the rook and also the queen at the same time. Hopefully you could follow along in that. Now, in a previous game with this similar setup, I moved the knight to G6, and to my surprise, the F7 pawn captured. Now, we did eventually capture the queen here, but I thought this time let's try the F7 square, targeting again the queen and the rook simultaneously. Black responds with E6, so let's go ahead and take the rook. Maxim comes out with the knight to C6. I'm going to come down with the light square bishop, take the pawn at G6, putting the king in check. King moves, and now I'm just going to go right back to the D3 square for protection. Now, the value of this simple move that you could look at and go, well, what did you accomplish? Well, what I accomplished was getting the king to move. I noticed if we go back, I noticed that the king had no one to, other than the queen, I should say, if I should move the light square bishop here, the king doesn't have anyone to block here other than, again, the queen, which would be disastrous. So the king has to move, and then I can move back to safety simply because the king, now having moved, does not have the luxury of castling. So I have removed that option from the king through this little scenario. So Maxim responds with knight to f6. I'm going to get my knight out of the corner there and move to g6, h5. And let me go back. Now you can see that we have an unprotected bishop here. Let's just go ahead and take. Simple. And now I'm also targeting the queen here in this scenario. The queen moves back to f7. Let's just move our knight right back where it is protected by the light square bishop. Queen moves back to e6. I'm going to push forward with the h3 pawn. Let me explain why. I notice that the queen has this light square diagonal to be able to come down to the g2 square and take, which would probably necessitate my castling at that point in order to protect. And also this knight could come down here to the g4 square. So I thought the easiest way to remedy that is just to move the pawn up to h3, protecting the g4 square. So in looking at the board and not really seeing right now any real damaging move that I could make, I decided to move the light square bishop to f5 and put some pressure upon the queen. Queen moves back to g8. And so I castle at this point to get my king to safety. Pawn comes up to e6, repelling my bishop. And so I'll just, again, move back to d3. The rook goes back to a8. Knight to e5, back to this very strategic square. And I had noticed that this knight at c6 is unprotected. If we get an exchange here, I can then take with my bishop, target the knight, and an exchange would be fully acceptable here. But Maxim chose to move the knight to a5. So you may have noticed that we have this unprotected pawn at a4, so it's very easy for us to just bring our queen here and to attack and capture that, and also exert some influence along this light square diagonal. Maxim responds by bringing his queen over to e8 in direct contention with my queen. Now, it is at this point that I have to make a decision. Do I want to exchange, or do I want to move my queen to a safe space, or even maybe a more strategic space? And this is basically what I did. I looked at the pieces on the board. Let me go through this. So black has a knight, a rook, a bishop, and a knight. I have 2 rooks, 2 knights, and 2 bishops. So in a sense, you could say it's 6-4. And so I have a strong advantage in just number of pieces. The other thing that I noticed in that is my king is in safety and black's king is really out in the open, making it easier to attack. So I did decide at this point to go ahead and make the exchange, and I think it was the best decision at the time. So I'm going to bring up my b2 pawn up to b4 and try and repel this knight here, put it on the run, but Maxim responds with h4, and so we'll just go ahead and take. I'm going to move my rook over to take advantage of this open file and to control it. Eventually, what I'd like to do is maybe get down to the b7 or b8 squares here, which are very advantageous for the rook. Maxim responds with a4. And let me go back, because we've talked about how to break through some of these protective structures for the king, especially when they concern pawns. In the past, we've taken our c pawn and moved it up to c4 and bring about a conflict here. But this time I decided just to kind of go right up the gut and challenge the d5 pawn, which I did. Maxim, for whatever reason, moves back the knight to h7, so we'll just go ahead and take the d5 pawn. The knight comes back to f6. Let's keep moving. We'll take the e6 pawn. And now we see a very real possibility of getting this pawn at e6 to the back rank. Maxim responds with bringing the knight to h5, targeting the bishop, but this is an easy resolve. Just bring the bishop forward to g5 and begin to control this dark square diagonal here. Rook to a5 once again. Now there is a cautionary tale in this that we need to see, and that is to be reminded that this rook has pinned our knight to our bishop, and our bishop is unguarded, unprotected. So we could very easily go, oh, this is a great opportunity to move my knight here, and then I can target the rook, but forget that the rook can just come over and take the bishop. So you just have to keep these kinds of moves in the back of your mind, and certainly consider before you move a piece that is pinned, make sure that the piece behind it is protected in some way. So we'll advance our pawn to e7, protected by this dark square bishop. The rook comes to d5, and we'll bring our rook down to b8 and pin this bishop to the king. The rook takes the knight, so we'll make the exchange a knight for a rook, and we'll take with the pawn. The king has to move to d7 in order to protect the light squared bishop. So we will move our light square bishop to b5 to put the king in check, and then this pawn moves up to e6 to block. Now, at this juncture of the game, I'll show you the move that I did make, and that was to come back, protect the bishop, and take the a4 pawn. However, in retrospect, as I've reviewed this video, it probably would have been better for me to go ahead and take this pawn. The reason is I would put the king in check. Now, the king would not be able to move back to this square, would not be able to move back to this square, for it would be still in check, and there's no way to block if I were to take the c6 pawn with the bishop, and the king would have to move here, or I guess here as well. Either of those three moves would allow me the opportunity to move my pawn to the back rank and get my queen. I didn't see that at the time, and that's part of the learning process. You go through these, you review your games, and you see these maybe mistakes or missed opportunities that you had, and so you correct it. You make note of it, so in the future games you're a little bit more aware of these scenarios. But in this one I was not. Took the a4 pawn. The black knight comes to f4, and I can easily take that. Queen takes the pawn, so I lose that opportunity that I might have had, but I have such an overwhelming influence here with my pieces that checkmate is definitely on the horizon, but I could have made it easier on myself if I had played that a little bit better. We'll come over now that the bishop is unguarded and take with the rook. Maxim responds with king to e6. Easy for us just to bring our knight up, capture this e6 pawn, and put the king in check. King moves down to d7. We're in no danger of being captured because of the protection from the light square bishop, but we can begin to advance this pawn toward the back rank. King is in check. King moves back. We'll bring our rook over to protect our pawn so that we can continue on in this advancement. The king comes to try and block, and of course this is very easy to resolve. Just bring our dark square bishop over, get the king off of that dark square in front of our pawn, and now continue to advance. The king will move to g8, and now we can move in with our queen, and the king is in check. Now let me go through how to play this scenario if you're not familiar with it. The king is going to move to the 7th rank, and there is a tendency maybe to think, well, I'll just move my rook down here and put the king in check, and forget, as I have done in previous games and earlier games, the king can escape out on the 6th rank. So the way to play this, quite simply, is just to bring the queen back to the 7th rank, put the king in check. The king is going to have to go to the 8th rank, and then bring your rook down to the 8th rank, and the game is over. Sure enough, that's what we do, and the game is completed. So another instructive game, we're going to move on to game 2, the London versus Maxim 1000. And once again, thank you for watching.